Good morning, Liberty Park Church family. Today we're reading and contemplating upon Acts chapter 15. In an overall sense, it is a great testament of how the early church worked through the very difficult question of whether new Gentile believers in Jesus Christ, in essence, had to become Jews by being circumcised in order to become followers of Jesus, as some were declaring. The church at Antioch sent Paul and Barnabas, as well as some other leaders from that church, to Jerusalem to meet with the apostles there to determine what the Holy Spirit would say about this question. Although there was no formal structure within the early church as we would be acquainted with today, the approach of seeking God's direction through leaders who had been chosen by God still is a valid biblical way of determining God's will in spiritual matters. In the final verses of this chapter, Luke mentions a controversy that arose between Paul and Barnabas over whether John Mark, who had suddenly left them on their first missionary journey, should accompany them on a second missionary journey they were planning. Barnabas wanted to take him. Paul did not. So in verses 39 to 41, the scriptures say, "And there arose a sharp disagreement. So they separated from one another. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers through the grace of the Lord. And he went to Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches." How in the world could these two spiritual leaders who had confronted together various challenges over a period of several years now find themselves on opposite ends of an issue regarding John Mark? Paul, who we know as the great apostle and who wrote much of the New Testament, was known for being pretty direct and at times critical of others who didn't follow Jesus the way he thought they should. There is no doubt that Paul had the mission of strengthening the churches which had been planted in their first missionary trip as his primary focus. Barnabas, on the other hand, was true to his character. In Acts chapter 4, verse 36, we first encounter Barnabas, who was also known as Joseph, but called Barnabas by the apostles in Jerusalem, which means son of encouragement, as he brought proceeds from the sale of a property that he sold and laid it at the apostles' feet. His willingness to serve and encourage others is seen on various occasions in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 9, it was Barnabas who brought Saul, later to be known as Paul, before the apostles in Jerusalem so they might hear of his conversion experience on the road to Damascus. Others were afraid of him due to his reputation prior to his conversion, and thus did not believe Saul was even a disciple of Christ. In Acts chapter 11, he left Antioch to go to Tarsus to look for Saul so they could both return to Antioch and teach and instruct the new believers there. After some time there, the church at Antioch heard of the famine in Judea and subsequently sent Barnabas and Paul with an offering to Jerusalem to the church there. According to Acts chapter 12, verse 25, Barnabas and Paul returned to Antioch after completing their service on behalf of the Antioch believers for the believers in Jerusalem, and John Mark accompanied them on this return to Antioch. In Acts chapter 13, Barnabas and Paul were set apart by the church at Antioch to go on a mission trip to the Gentiles. We know John Mark was a member of this mission team as we read in Acts chapter 13, verse 13, that when the team came to Perga in Pamphylia, John Mark left them and returned home to Jerusalem. Nothing more is said about John Mark until the passage is found in Acts 15 that we're looking at, where there was that controversy between Paul and Barnabas regarding him. In Acts 13 and 14, we read the details of the first missionary journey of Paul accompanied by Barnabas. They ultimately returned to Antioch to report to the church that sent them out on the mission. From there, they were sent to represent the church at the Jerusalem Council that I referred to earlier, and then returned to Antioch afterwards. It was there that this personal conflict arose. So I raise the question with you as we close this time together. Do we need to be more like Paul or more like Barnabas? The truth is that the church needs both type of leaders who they represented. Listen to what Warren Wiersbe sums up this occurrence with. This was a case where Paul and Barnabas agreed on the importance of the trip, their planned second missionary journey, but they could not agree upon whom should make up their larger team. Here are two dedicated men who had just helped bring unity to the church, and yet they could not settle their own disagreements. Disturbing and painful as these conflicts are, they are often found in church history, and yet God is able to overrule them and accomplish his purposes. That Barnabas would champion John Mark is certainly no surprise. Paul was just as adamant that they not take John Mark. The ministry was too important, and the work was too demanding to enlist someone who might prove unreliable. Who was right? Perhaps both men were right on some things and wrong on some other things. We know that John Mark ultimately did succeed in ministry and that Paul came to love and appreciate him according to 1 Timothy 4:11. So Paul looked at people and asked oftentimes, what can they do for God's work? Barnabas looked at people and asked, what can God's work do for people? God used both of these men in mighty ways to plant and strengthen the early churches. May God use their examples to encourage you and me today as we seek to serve him as part of his family.